Welcome back to the program. If you're just joining us, this is your favorite Pan-African show, Bottomline Africa, right here on KTN News. Now, let me just remind you once again, our Twitter poll question, and we did ask you, do you think, or do you believe, or do you think the resolve by African leaders to root out corruption in the continent will succeed? This is something that has remained the top agenda of the 30th AU Summit. So we're asking you, do you think the resolve by African leaders to root out corruption in the continent will succeed? We'd like to hear your view. Our Twitter handle is at KTN News. You can as well tweet me at Yusuf Ibra. And corruption was not the only thing that was discussed in Addis Ababa. Of course, they talked about single African air transport market, promise to fight corruption, of course, and plans to address the continent's crisis dominated the African Union Summit there in Addis Ababa. So let's begin with corruption there, which has been the top agenda. The African leaders have committed to fighting corruption, of course, and are now asking for a consolidated fight against the vice. Reports indicate that Africa loses $50 billion annually through corruption. That's a very huge amount of cash. And then something else that was discussed in Addis Ababa is everything to do with peace and security. The leaders resolved to delay, of course, the withdrawal of AU forces from Somalia, according to them, up until the country's military is stable. Plus, they also discussed in detail the crisis in South Sudan, with the African Union now even threatening to take more punitive action against the country to restore sanity in the war-ravaged nation. Of course, top on the agenda in the AU summit was also reports of slave labor in Libya, as well as proposed AU reforms under the current chairman, Rwanda's President Paul Kagame. Once again in studio, we have Mr. Zulu Elvis, who is the Executive Director, Institute for Development Policy, well known as AFIDEP. We also have Richard Tuta, who's a security analyst. Joining me all the way from Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, is Taye Belgun from Africans Rising. Let me begin with Taye. Actually, good evening, gentlemen. First, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good evening.
So let me begin with Taye, who's joining me via phone from Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. And Taye, good evening. It's good to have you back on the show once again. And apparently, corruption has remained the topmost agenda during the AU summit there in Addis Ababa. Do you feel encouraged? Do you believe that Africans finally are going to really fight corruption once and for all?
Good evening. Thank you so much for having me once again. And I mean, you know, it's always business as usual when this heads of state finally set up to come to Addis for the general election.
Yes.
And I think, you know, the conversation has been in the last couple of days has been, you know, can we really do this, as opposed to, you know, talking to preaching to the folks that we know they cannot convert anymore. It's a concern that, you know, some of these heads of state have been, there are so many allegations against them,
yes,
from human rights to economic issues, from different issues. And right now, I think from the meeting they had yesterday, the conversation is not tilting towards anti-corruption. The conversation is just, how can we benefit from each other? And that's the reason why civil society here in Addis Ababa are putting more pressure on them to focus on the strategy. We don't want to talk about the problem. We know there's a corruption problem in the continent. But how do we implement in the next couple of months
actually, yes, Taye, actually that informs my second question. Of course, there are those leaders there, the AU summit, who have talked about the need to have some sort of a consolidated fight against corruption in the whole continent. Have they perhaps outlined some of the steps that they might take to achieve it?
Absolutely none. As I speak to you, there is no conversation. There is no conversation regarding that, and that's the concern for us. We want to see the strategy. We want to see what is doable. The ICC is not being, you know, a lot of heads of state have pulled out. Government have pulled out from the ICC. So how do we measure? How do we take ourselves accountable for certain things that certain countries have been doing?
Yes.
Who are the heads of state accountable for? Who can they if there is something that happens in a particular country, who can we call for? And the African Union is just being very softened on them. And as you can tell, they are not even giving civil society the room to even talk to them. So there's a lot of closed-door meetings, and there's no conversation regarding that. And I think this is a danger for, there's a lot of thematic topic every year, but I don't think we're heading there yet. Until we have a strategy that everybody knows, all the is open to civil society, women groups, and all that youth groups across the continent, then we can say the government are ready, the African Union are ready to take this thing forward. But as of this moment, I don't think so.
Tai, one final question. Apart from corruption, the need to fight corruption, what else was on the table there at the summit?
I mean, there is a lot of question about, security.
Yes.
I mean, security is always a situation on the continent, especially looking at South Sudan. A lot of young people have come from South Sudan to put pressure on certain things.
Yes.
And, even they have visa challenges, and to even get them to Addis Ababa to protest and do quite a number of things. I know how Addis Ababa is. There's a little bit of there's a little bit you can do in terms of getting your voice to be heard. However, I think security is also entangled with this whole situation of anti-corruption because we do know that the harms that are getting into this conflict regions or conflict communities are being sold by the Westerners as well. So corruption doesn't only stand on the continent; is a two-way thing. Corruption is coming from the West and also by the receiver, who are the African leaders as well.
Well explained, Tai. Thank you very much, Tai, for your input. That is Tai Belgun from Africans Rising, talking to me all the way from Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Of course, we talked about matters corruption as well as security. And speaking about security, we have a security analyst in the studio. That is Richard Tuta, as well as Zulu Elvis. He is Executive Director from FIDEP. Now, let me begin with you, Zulu. You've already mentioned about last year's theme, the AU Summit theme, which has everything to do with harnessing the demographic dividend through investment in youth. And this year, they're talking about fighting corruption. I mean, they can't realize this last year's theme if corruption is not fought, right?
Yes, you are right that actually not just last year's theme, but for Africa to achieve the socio-economic transformation agenda that is very well articulated in Agenda 2063. Corruption is what you might call the big elephant in the room.
Yes.
I mean, Agenda 2063 is really a very, very progressive document. It talks about, really, by 2063, creating a prosperous Africa that is peaceful, where every African is given a decent chance to actually thrive, as opposed to barely, surviving or struggling just to make ends meet or put basic necessities like food on the table. So it's very, very clear that if corruption continues at the rate that is going, it just gave us the statistic that African countries lose about $50 billion a year through corruption. Just think about what that money would do in improving education, in improving healthcare, in actually transforming this big youthful population that Africa has into a driving force for socioeconomic transformation. The continent would really be further ahead. So I think it's good. For me, I'm encouraged that the African Union has put this very, very critical issue on the agenda. But what really matters, as the colleague in Addis was saying, is not talking about the problem. I think we know the statistics. We know how much money. I mean, I was looking at the data for Kenya, that came out in 2016, showing that 6 billion shillings is lost in Kenya through corruption. Nigeria, by what? The numbers go as far as about a third of their gross domestic product gets lost through corruption. Yes. And when you conceptualize that, the per capita income in Nigeria now is about $2,200 per person. but corruption alone is taking away about 1,000. So if there was no corruption, per capita GDP would be about 3,000 in Nigeria.
Well put. Well put, Dr. Elias. Sorry, I called you Elvis earlier. Now, allow me to engage Richard, who is a security expert, and I'm sure Richard also follows very closely the political situation in the continent. Now, Richard, both Somalia and South Sudan have been ranked as the worst corrupt nations, not just in the continent, but across the world. This is a very bad picture for the continent.
I think what we need to ask ourselves is whether the two countries are corrupt, as it's being said, by default or by design. Because you realize that behind the corruption maybe in Somalia and in Southern Sudan, there are both countries in Africa and in the West that are benefiting from that corruption. So they may still want it to remain as it is. So they will always struggle to make sure that the status quo remains the way it is, as long as they will continue benefiting from that corruption. And I think the reason as to why it is where it is today, it's not by default, it is by design. Yes.
Dr. Elias, do you agree with Richard? Perhaps poor governance and corruption, these are two things that go hand in hand?
Oh, yes. Of course, you know, when we talk about corruption, we have to go back to the definition of what corruption is. This is really people who are using their position in power, their entrusted position for personal gain. So if in situations where corruption is allowed to flourish, that's just the biggest indicator that governance is very, very weak. So one of the most critical things that needs to be fixed in order to address corruption has to be really making sure that there's accountability, that governance is actually premised on justice, on rights, and on the rule of law. When those three things break apart, then it's going to be hard for you to address corruption because people will do whatever they want to do.
And Richard, I don't know if you'll agree with this, that those who come from the school of thought that, you know, insecurity and corruption go hand in hand. Apparently, the militants, you know, in Somalia, for example, the Al-Shabaab, in Kenya, for instance, in the northern part of the country, Boko Haram in Nigeria. I mean, are these two aspects also related?
There are those who will say that insecurity and corruption is a necessary necessity. Because you always, like for instance, what is happening, a very good example is what is happening in Southern Sudan. As it is currently, you realize that Southern Sudan has a standing army made up of almost 200,000 plus, whereby almost 55% of its annual budget goes towards facilitating the activities of the army, whereby 80% of that goes towards paying the salary for the various army officers. And you see behind the 55% of that budget, there is matters to do with the procurement. And normally what happens when it comes to defense budgets all over the country, all over the world, is something that they call black budget, whereby this is a budget that is not open to any scrutiny. This is a budget that every defense or every army in any particular country will always conceal it. The reason why, as to why they conceal it, because if you want to know the strength of any army all over the world, look at its budget. So they will always try as much as possible to conceal their budget so that the enemy may not understand exactly their strength for purposes of the element of surprise.
Dr. Elias, once again, the African leaders at the AU summit, apparently they talked of the need to come up with some sort of a consolidated way in fighting corruption all across the continent. But as Ty has briefed us earlier, they didn't go into detail. I mean, do you think they might be in danger of just playing lip service, perhaps? And there's one viewer here, at Martin Mato, is saying it's like a pack of hyenas promising you that they're going to be vegetarians from tomorrow.
Yeah, you are right. I think there's a big danger that the African Union can actually just be about rhetoric and very, very little action. And over the years, there's actually been a lot of resolutions that the African Union has come up with, but which have not resulted into real action at national level, which is really where our policies are implemented. So it's very, very critical. I think for me, as an expert working in the development field, when the African Union decides to put an issue at the top of the development agenda like corruption, I think that it's up to us, because in a way what the leaders have done is that they have opened the door to say we recognize this is an issue, although many of them may not have the political will, but we have to use that commitment to now translate it into actions at national level. I think the African Union can only do so much. I think by putting it on the top of the agenda, to me, I think that's a positive thing. Now, the question is, how do we make sure that at country level, we hold our presidents who have gone there and made all these pronouncements to say, what is this translating to at country level? So that's where we need to push the agenda. That's where the civil society organizations and everybody else needs to come together. But I think coming up with a continent-wide strategy against corruption, I mean, there's a big danger there that this can just end up at rhetoric level, but we need really the action has to be at country level. And I think it's up to us now to get down to the countries and make sure that we reinforce accountability to what our leaders have agreed on there.
Well said. Now, Richard, let me take you back to your forte, that is security. I'm sure I know you're an expert there. Now, I want you to rate AU when it comes to security. For example, in Somalia, the AU summit today, they delayed the withdrawal of AU troops there up until the forces there stabilize. They failed to bring any kind of solution to South Sudan. And remember, during the Burundi crisis, they went into that country and brought some sort of stability. How would you rate, in a nutshell, how AU has performed when it comes to security?
I think it will depend from which perspective you look at security. If you look at security from a wider perspective, then you will say that AU is performing below average. But if you look at security from a narrower perspective, whereby you look at security in terms of deployment of peacekeeping forces, both in Somalia and some other countries that currently are experiencing challenges, then you will say that it is operating above average. But back to what you had said, what you had raised earlier on the issue of corruption and security, you realize that sometimes in the year 2006, the current president of Southern Sudan threatened to spill the beans on who among his commanders were being involved in corruption, something that has never happened up to today. That one tells you something, that some of these heads of states from Africa are hostage. They are being held hostage by various corrupt cartels back at home. And sometimes it will be very difficult for them to shoot themselves on the foot.
Thank you, Richard, for that. I think that will serve as your final comment. Now, Dr. Elias, I'd like to hear your final comment very briefly. And one of our viewers here, once again, says, unless God himself comes physically to fight this animal called corruption, it is impossible to fight it. I'm sure, these are very pessimistic views from people. Where will that leave the war against corruption? Very briefly.
I think that people are very justified to really be pessimistic, but as I said before, by putting it at the African Union agenda, it opens the window. But the action has to happen in our own countries. I think it's ourselves as citizens who, in many ways, allow corruption to happen. When our leaders are doing all these political campaigns, spending these, huge amounts of money, we are all there celebrating and so on. But what we need to know is, if somebody spends 20 billion shillings or 20 billion kwacha in Malawi or wherever in Africa or nairas, they are going to get that money back. So we need to start holding our leaders to account by making sure that we don't condone it. And corruption, we can look at it. Corruption is at two levels. There's grand corruption that the top leadership in the country can actually mastermind, but there's also petty corruption, where if we are getting to a point where to do any little thing, we have to pay 200 shillings there, or whatever amount of money. I think we have to sit back as African people to say, enough is enough. And as citizens, we are the ones who need to put a stop to this. And I think once we put this on top of our development agendas in our countries, on top of our political agendas, our leaders will listen to this. The reason why they continue doing it and just finish that is that they know they can get away with it.
Basically, everyone has to play a role in fighting corruption. Thank you very much, Dr. Elias Zulu, for your input. He's the Executive Director, African Institute for Development Policy, well known as AFIDEP. Richard Tuta, security analyst, always a pleasure to have in the show, as well as Taya Bilgun, who had joined me earlier from Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. He is, of course, from Africans Rising. Thank you, gentlemen, for your input. Now, let's cross over to images of the day. In Chinese scientists have